Hello, and welcome to the Magic of Calvin and Hobbes, a fan celebration. My name is Ryan, and I am a self-proclaimed Calvin and Hobbes superfan and expert.
And my name is also Ryan, although most people call me Indy.
We're continuing our celebration of 40 years of Calvin and Hobbes, and as always, we just need to quickly make some disclaimers that we're not associated with Bill Watterson. We don't have the rights to his comics, so we can't display them on any versions of our podcast, but we can, as always, provide a link to a blog post that gives you the dates of publication and the books that they were published in, including page number. All right, now before we get going, I have a couple of updates for you, Indy. So first of all, big news. We have now exceeded 1,000 total downloads of our episodes combined. So
Awesome.
yeah, that's pretty cool. More interesting, so episode 7, Susie Durkins, we got some feedback from my wife, so a couple things that you might be interested to hear. First of all, you are correct. Susie's haircut is a bob cut,
Okay.
according to my wife. And she said while she was listening to the episode, when I said pixie cut, she was furiously texting to tell me that it was a bob cut. And then you said it might be a bob cut. She was like, dang it, Indy. But,
That's funny. Well, I'm sorry if I stole your wife's thunder in that way.
yeah, but you were correct. So good job on that. And then in that episode, we also talked about the amino acid versus onion costume. And I said that making an amino acid costume would be really difficult. She actually, knows how to sew, so I think her opinion counts here. She says that the onion costume would be more difficult because you'd have to either, stuff the bottom or something to make it flare out, or you'd have to have like a wire frame and then getting the eye holes in just the right place and actually stay there. And all that would be a really big pain. And she had the idea that you could make an amino acid costume kind of like symbolic, like
Okay.
I don't know if it would be just on your head or something on your shoulders, but like you could just put balls and pool noodles together to kind of symbolically represent an amino acid.
I see.
So,
That's
that
a good
wouldn't be so.
point. Yeah, maybe it
Yeah,
would look kind of like what do they call it, Mr. DNA from Jurassic Park or whatever. Dino DNA.
exactly. Yeah, something like that. Now, she did say in the 80s that could have been more difficult because you couldn't Google what does an amino acid look like. So
That's,
unless you had a textbook handy or something, that could be difficult if you're not a biochemist. So
yeah.
two sides of the coin there.
Yeah, I never really considered the overlap between biochemistry and sewing until now, but that may be an underrepresented field or discipline we're talking about now.
Maybe that's why biochemists don't learn to sew very often. Like, what's even the point?
Yeah, but they marry wives who sew, so it all works out.
Yeah. So, yeah, it's all good.
Awesome.
And
All right. Well,
one
shout out
last
to your
thing.
wife then.
Yeah. And one
Uh,
last thing. We got an email from someone that we don't know. So this is the first communication that we've had from a listener that's not someone that we already know. So this is cool.
right. And
So
not like a spam thing, too. Like we did get some things that were clearly not really listeners, like, oh man, you should totally like. So yeah,
yeah,
okay.
you should buy our podcast software and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, no, this is from someone who actually listens to our podcast and enjoys it. So this is
Awesome.
from Mark. And the title of this email is I Love Your Podcast.
All right.
So I just wanted to shout out a little bit of it. He says, hi, folks. I'm an avid Calvin and Hobbes fan from the UK. So that's pretty cool. And he says, I have recently become engrossed, or should that be engrossed, you know, in
Nice.
your fabulous podcast. I was looking something up the other day, which caused me to wonder whether I could find any CNH podcasts, and I was delighted to discover yours. I've spent the last few days catching up with the 8 episodes so far, and I very much look forward to the rest. I have spread the word amongst my fellow CNH lovers. So thank you, Mark. He
Yeah. Thank you very
also,
much, Mark. Yeah. And
yeah,
we're
and
going international now. That's amazing.
I know we are now international superstars. And he also tells us that he recently discovered a BBC radio program released in 2009 dedicated to Calvin and Hobbes. It was a 30-minute show, and they got Lee Salem on there. For anyone who doesn't know who Lee Salem is, he was Bill Watterson's editor. So that's a program that I'm going to have to check out. He provided a link. You may have to be in the UK to be able to access it, but if it's accessible, I will go ahead and pop that into the show notes so anyone who's interested can give it a listen.
Wow, that's really cool.
Yeah.
All right. Well,
And
thank you to Mark and all our many other listeners. We'd love to hear from you.
absolutely. And just one other thing I thought I'd throw out there. In our winter episode, we talked about snowballs, and we couldn't think of any where Calvin instigates and hits Hobbes with a snowball without Hobbes hitting Calvin with a snowball simultaneously, right?
Okay.
So there was one. I found one that I didn't think of in the moment. So Hobbes is walking along and Calvin hits him with a snowball and then runs up and starts interviewing about it. Did you notice the top spin and all that stuff? And then the last panel is Calvin hanging from a branch of a tree by his underwear, saying, "A real friend would have been happy for me."
That's true. Okay, I remember that now. It's like, wasn't that impressive how well I did that
Yeah,
snowball? Okay, that's
yeah.
right.
So we just had to give that little update just so that we have the full scope of Calvin and Hobbes hitting each other with snowballs.
Nice correction. And that's at least the second time that Hobbes has suspended Calvin from his underwear. Do you remember what the other time was?
Oh, not coming to me off the top. Get me started.
Okay, so Calvin is talking about wasps that were attacking
Oh
him.
yeah, yeah. He throws a rock at the wasp's nest, and he's telling Hobbes about that he's done that, and then Hobbes hangs him up as bait for the wasps, thinking that
Right. It's like
Calvin's
a
been
real
mean.
friend wouldn't take their side.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. Yeah, good catch. So with that, we'll jump right in. This episode, we're going to be talking about something that's a little less thematic than previous episodes. And by that, I mean, in other episodes, we've talked about things like Christmas in Calvin and Hobbes that comes up in multiple different ways. Today, we're talking about the transmogrifier. It's one very specific thing in Calvin and Hobbes that comes up a few different times. So we're going to go over the different stories in which the transmogrifier appears and talk about what we like about those. So we're going to be taking a little bit of a deeper dive into that and a little bit of some other stuff related to cardboard box inventions. And that leads me nicely into the point that the transmogrifier is the first in a series of cardboard box inventions. So Calvin uses a big cardboard box, and from the perspective of an outsider, his mom or his dad, they would see him just playing in a cardboard box, pretending that it's some amazing invention. But to Calvin, just in the same way that Hobbes is a real tiger, the cardboard box really is a fantastic invention.
I think I'm on Calvin's side on this one. The parents just don't know what's going on.
Yeah, I mean, when you're a kid, you get in that cardboard box, you really do turn into a different animal, or you do blast off to the moon, or whatever, right? I mean, that's quintessential kid playing in a
Exactly.
box. And whether you're pretending that box is a transmogrifier or a rocket or whatever, I think almost every little kid, at least in the United States and probably elsewhere, has done that. They've made a cardboard box be some amazing toy.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, cardboard boxes are actually some of the most fun toys that I think kids ever have. I mean, like you said, pretending, that's always fun. But even if you're not pretending, it can just be fun to be in a box. Like, I remember when my sister and I were very young, we had this refrigerator box and we spent hours playing in that thing. It's hours just laughing and kind of trying to move it around and knock it over while we were inside. And I'm sure we pretended stuff too, but like just boxes are just weirdly fun. And I think, like you said, as quintessential kid, this is something I think that everyone can sort of identify with, just the fun of a box.
Yeah, I mean, my siblings and I did that too with a refrigerator box specifically. Those are the best. Like
Those are the
yeah, we had it set up in the backyard, and we'd climb in, and then we'd knock it over, and you'd have to try to compensate for whichever way they're pushing you, and it's
yeah.
great fun. Yeah,
I knew that was universal. Like you knew exactly what I was
absolutely.
talking about and could relate.
Yeah. Well, and even just right now, up until yesterday in my living room, my daughter had this cardboard box fort set up, and it's still set up somewhere. I just had to move it out of the living room. But she's just been hanging out in her cardboard box all week, and she's been loving it.
Are you jealous?
A little. I can't fit in the fort, so
Yeah. I mean, that's the other thing too. Like, especially the refrigerator box, when you're small, it's like it's huge, and like, yeah, it could be a fort or whatever you want. Like you said, just hang out or knock it over and things. So, yeah, and this is something that the Calvin and Hobbes strip actually calls out too in a similar way. So we won't go into the details of that strip right now because it comes at the end of a story arc we're going to visit in another episode. But near the end, there's this other box that they get, and Hobbs is like, "Oh boy, now we'll have some fun." So it's just
Yes.
yes, this box, just a box, is an amazing source of fun by itself.
Yeah, on a kind of related note, it makes me think of when I was a kid. Sometimes for Christmas or birthdays, my parents, especially when we were really little, would get us like a box of Band-Aids or a box of straws, and it was a great present. They got me some Ninja Turtle Band-Aids, and I was just over the moon because I could use these Band-Aids for whatever I wanted. And so it didn't have to be this fancy toy. And that's what a box is. A box can be anything, and you can just do whatever you want with it, and it's some of the most fun.
Yeah, it's weird. Like, I mean, little kids, and Calvin, of course, is a great example of this, but they have just this amazing imagination. But then you get this crop, which isn't really much of anything on its own if you think about it sort of objectively, and then it just magnifies its imagination 100-fold. And I don't know, there's something magical about cardboard boxes, which is part of why it became such an iconic part of Calvin and Hobbes.
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking of Calvin's cardboard box inventions, let's just recap real quick. Andy, will you just go over quickly what the core cardboard box inventions are? We're not going to go into details on all of them, but just so we have an overview.
Right. Okay. So obviously the transmogrifier, the subject of
Right.
this episode. There's also the duplicator, which I think we mentioned before, combined the existing technologies of the transmogrifier and a photocopier, which I
Right.
just really appreciate the scientific explanation for that. Oh yeah, there's these existing technologies already. We just put them together. So of course this makes sense.
Absolutely.
There's that. There's the time machine, and there's one other which it only appears in one strip. I think maybe we'll save that for a little later because that's only, I believe, in that one case, so it's not as maybe iconic as the others. But that's something we'll get to after a while.
Yeah, we'll come back to that one. But those three that you mentioned, the transmogrifier, the duplicator, and the time machine, are kind of the big ones. And
Yeah.
you can tell which one it is by how the box is oriented. So with the transmogrifier, you crawl under it. With the duplicator, the box is on its side and you walk into it. And with the time machine, the box is open at the top and you climb inside and sit down in it.
Right, which leads to this great interchange between Calvin and Hobbes at one point, where Calvin's showing off one of the inventions, and Hobbes says, "This looks like your transmogrifier." And Calvin is almost offended. It's like, well, to the inattentive and brainless layman, yes, but you crawl
Yes.
under the transmogrifier. This is on its side now. So it's like, get with the program, Hobbes. Come on.
Are you not paying attention at all? Yeah,
Like, where have you been?
right. And so we'll get to that other invention that astute listeners may know what it is if you're very familiar with Calvin and Hobbes, but if you don't, we'll just leave you hanging for a little bit. Just stay tuned with us. But we will mention that in this episode because, like the transmogrifier, this also has the box upside down. But
Yes.
more on that later.
There actually is one other makeshift use of the box too, and what was that?
So one time there was an emergency meeting of Gross when Susie comes over to their house, and the box of secrecy was used as a temporary headquarters. But we'll talk more about that when we get to the Gross episode.
Yes.
So the transmogrifier. That's today's topic. What does a transmogrifier do? Well, very simply, it turns one thing into another. But I think it's worth pointing out, as we've mentioned in a previous episode, that that word transmogrifier, I think, wasn't, if it existed at all, it wasn't really well known until Bill Watterson used it in Calvin and Hobbes. But now we know, oh, yeah, a transmogrifier turns one thing into another.
Right. Yeah, I kind of think he made it up. I could be wrong about that, but like you said, now, I mean, I think even people who aren't really into Calvin and Hobbes, or maybe aren't into, that sort of material or imagination, probably will still know what you mean if you say transmogrify. Like, it's become that ubiquitous in the lexicon.
Right. And so how it works, with the box, you climb into the chamber, so you get under the box, and someone outside the box sets the dial to whatever you want to turn into, and then they push the button and zap, and that's the sound it makes, and now you're whatever thing you wanted to be. And according to Calvin, the process is instantaneous and completely painless, which is good to know.
Yeah, that's a good bonus.
So here's the question, though. When Calvin first shows Hobbes the transmogrifier, he shows him several different things that you can turn the dial to, that you can become. And Hobbes asks a very important question. What if you want to be something else? Well, then what do you do?
Well, he left some room on the side, so you just write it.
Yeah, and it's that easy, which
Yeah.
I think is perfectly logical and also just, again, speaks to a kid's imagination. Yeah, what do you mean? What do you do? Just add it on there. What's the big deal?
I mean, if the box can reconfigure your molecular structure, I mean, reading something you write on the side of it should be child's play, right?
Seems pretty trivial. Once again, I see what you did there. So in the first instance, when Calvin uses the Transmogrifier, this happens pretty early on in Something Under the Bed is Drooling. This is within maybe just a little more than the first year of Calvin and Hobbes. Calvin waffles about what he wants to be. So first he says, set the dial to lungfish. No, muskox. No, but ultimately he settles on tiger.
Much to Hobbes' approval, his reaction is, the world could always use another tiger.
Which I don't necessarily disagree. I like tigers. So yeah. I think that was a good choice.
Yeah. I will say real quick, so this didn't necessarily strike me like the first 600 times I read this strip, but then going back on reflection, I'm like, was he really thinking of turning himself into a fish? That seems like a bad idea, given that the box is just there on the ground. Like, I'm kind of glad he didn't pick that one.
Well, he did say lungfish, so that'd be better than, a fish that absolutely requires the water. But yeah, still maybe not the best choice.
Yeah.
But ultimately, he settles on tiger, and when he comes out, he's this really cute, smaller version of Hobbes, basically. I love it.
Yeah, I agree. On both. I mean, obviously, the small thing. I agree that he looks really cute, too. Now, Calvin and Hobbes themselves are disappointed about this, presumably because Calvin is so much smaller. Now, also, fun fact, this is one of only a few instances in the strip where we can see more than one tiger pictured at a time. And Ryan, can you think of any other instances like that?
Okay, the first one that comes to mind is another cardboard box invention one. So we'll talk about this more, but in another episode. But in one of the time travel story arcs, Calvin and Hobbes travel a few hours to the future, and the 6:30 Calvin and Hobbes meet the 8:30 Calvin and Hobbes. So we see 6:30 and 8:30 Hobbes together in a few strips in that one. So there's two tigers there. Outside of that, I mean, they go to the zoo and there are implied tigers, but we don't actually see them. And there's a case where we see a how to draw sort of thing for drawing a tiger, but I don't know if that really counts. Are there any others you're thinking of?
So yeah, I mean, it's a little bit of a not exactly trick question, but I said more than one tiger pictured. So you're certainly right about the time travel where we get 6:30 Hobbes and 8:30 Hobbes together. There's also, I think, two cases where we see Hobbes and a picture of a tiger. So one is, I think we referred to this strip before, Calvin has an art assignment, I think, to draw his pet, but since he doesn't have a pet, he draws Hobbes. Hobbes ends up drawing it, and we get this sort of ferocious looking tiger drawing that we see at the same time as Hobbes. Right. And then the other one would be the cover of, I believe, Scientific Progress Goes Boink, where we see, this actually shows the duplicator, I think, but we see Hobbes, and on the wall of Calvin's bedroom is a framed drawing of a tiger that either Calvin or Hobbes must have done.
Okay. Wow, that is quite the deep cut. Well done.
Thank you. Yeah. I mean, again, like maybe a little bit of a trick question, but I don't know, just something that kind of occurred to me in thinking about this episode.
Yeah. I guess you could also kind of count the time where Calvin becomes a tiger by dressing up in his pajamas, but I don't know if that exactly counts.
It's not exactly the same, although he does try to think about or think like and embody the essence of tigerhood, so we might could count that.
Yeah.
That one always strikes me as a little bit funny because that one post-dates the one we're talking about now, where he actually transmogrifies into a tiger. And it's sort of funny to me that he's like, oh, I know, you can teach me how to be a tiger. I'll dress up, we'll paint stripes on me and stuff. Well, I might have mentioned this before in a previous episode, but it's just, I don't know, I find it
Yeah.
amusing that it's like, but you've already transmogrified yourself into a tiger. Like you were more a tiger then than you were, but
Yeah, why not just do that again? Yeah.
yeah. But I mean, it's still funny either way.
Yeah, and it's still a great story arc.
Yeah.
Now, this story is short, but as we've mentioned before, this is a pivotal one. As Watterson said, the strip's whole world opened up with this story, this idea that a cardboard box can become anything. Now, Calvin spends a little time as a tiger. From the reader's perspective, it's a few days. You know, if you were reading this in the newspaper, you'd see him as a tiger on maybe Wednesday, and then by the following Tuesday or something, he's not a tiger anymore. It's unclear exactly how long within the time frame of the strip Calvin is a tiger. It feels like not more than about a day. But in any case, during this time, he exhibits hunger kind of like Hobbes's hunger, and he wants tuna fish. His mom says, I thought you didn't like tuna fish. And he says, well, I didn't, but now I transmogrified, I'm a tiger. And she says, I thought Hobbes was your tiger. And he is very confused about why his mom isn't more surprised, and later why his dad isn't more surprised that he's a tiger.
Yeah, I believe when he asks his dad if he notices anything different, he guesses new haircut. And you remember
Right?
Calvin's reaction?
Geez, did you go blind? I'm a tiger.
Yeah, it's like from Calvin's perspective, it's like, what is wrong with these people? It's like, I think he's also the one where going back to his mom, you see him thinking to himself like, oh, well, she's taking this very well, but the strain will surely crack her soon.
Yes. And I also like the dad's response when he says, did you go blind? His dad says, oh, I thought you meant besides that. Calvin, your
Yeah,
dad's very tired. And
it's like, oh, of course. I mean, obviously you're a tiger, but I thought, yeah, something else too. That's as good a save as he probably could have made there, I suppose.
yeah, pretty
Yeah,
quick
I
thinking.
think right. And this is a common feature of not only Calvin's transmogrifications, but the effects of some of his other inventions and shenanigans. His parents are surprisingly unfazed by this. And sometimes we get these sort of sarcastic thoughts to himself, like, I don't know why I even worried. They never noticed anything.
Yes. Now, ultimately, at the end of all this, this fairly short story arc, Calvin changes back. Although, first, when Hobbes is supposed to set the dial to boy, he accidentally turns Calvin into something that appears to me to be a large frog. I don't know, maybe it's a lungfish. Maybe he ultimately got that. I'm not quite sure what it is.
Looks like
But
a frog to me, too. I mean,
yeah, I think it's a frog. And then at the end of that, Calvin says that he's done transmogrifying for now, although maybe we could trick Susie into getting in there and turn her into a bowl of chowder. And she says, leave me out of your life's plans, you little weirdo, because she hears him as she's walking by. And
yeah.
that's pretty much the whole first transmogrifier story.
On that note, it would be interesting if Calvin had ever like invited Susie to be transmogrified instead of trying to, weaponize it, I guess we'll say. But I don't know, that might have been cute if it's like then you saw Susie playing along and both of them were something else. But
Yeah, I wonder how that would have gone with, Susie not seeing Hobbes the way Calvin sees Hobbes. Would she have seen being transmogrified in quite the same way Calvin would have? That would have been interesting to explore.
yeah, it would. And even though she doesn't see Hobbes the same way, she does talk to him and treat
Yeah, and
him.
she pretends.
Yeah, she treats him probably more like a person than anyone other than Calvin. So I think there would have
Right.
at least been some potential there for a story like that.
Yeah, and I mean, she certainly is able to pretend to be a grown up and, the president of the United States or a patient of the doctor or whatever. So that
That
could have been
doesn't usually
fun.
go well, but yes,
Well, yeah, which could have also led to some fun if she'd been transmogrified. There could have been some headbutting there.
exactly.
Now, fun fact, that story arc is the only newspaper story arc. I'm going to have to use a couple of qualifiers here. It's the only newspaper story arc that uses the transmogrifier as the kind of primary driving force. There is one other story arc that uses the transmogrifier box, but it's only used briefly. So there's a little teaser for you for a later episode. We'll come back to that at another time. But as far as it being the driving force, that's the only story arc that uses the transmogrifier. Now, in the authoritative Calvin and Hobbes, there is a bonus story that we talked about when we went through all the books, but I'm going to talk about it in a little greater detail now. This is the one where Calvin is having a hard time memorizing his vocabulary words, and then he gets an idea, he drags out the box, and I guess now it must have an automatic timer or something because he just crawls under it without anyone helping him, and we hear a zap. And then we switch camera angles, so to speak, to his mom, who is hearing a whomp, whomp, whomp from upstairs. And she yells, "Calvin, quit stomping around. You're supposed to be doing his homework." And then we see, for the first time, a huge panel that would have incidentally been impossible in newspaper strips. Even in the later Sunday format, this could have been difficult to pull off. But we see that Calvin is now an elephant, and he says, "I am doing my homework."
Yeah, and I think his mom, even just from hearing the loud whumping sound, even says, "You sound like an elephant up there." And then, of course,
That's
that
right.
helps sell the joke because then we see he is an elephant calling out that he's doing his homework.
Yes, exactly. So why did he turn into an elephant, though? Why did he pick that?
Well, it's because elephants never forget. So memorizing his vocabulary words will be easy.
Yeah, so he just reads through them. Now he can go out and play. And I like this next interchange. He walks up to Hobbes, who is sleeping in a tree, and says, "Hey, Hobbes, notice anything different about me?" And Hobbes, springs up like a cat who's been scared, and his fur all puffs out and everything. And then he says, "Calvin, my, how you've grown since I last saw you." So I like, first of all, the reaction that Hobbes gives, but also that he's able to just recognize Calvin. Oh, yeah, you're an elephant. I mean, you've changed, but yeah, obviously you're Calvin.
Yeah, see, he could tell. I don't know why his dad is so blind.
Yeah. So anyway, now Hobbes and Calvin go to play in the mud because elephants love mud. And while they're playing, Susie walks up and says, "Hey, Calvin, boy, look at you." And so there's this juxtaposition where obviously Calvin is seeing himself as an elephant, but Susie is just seeing Calvin covered from head to toe in mud. So that's what she's saying, "Boy, look at you," about. And Calvin responds with, "Impressive, huh? I'm surprised you even recognized me." And Susie says, "I'll admit it wasn't easy." So I just enjoy this interchange where they're talking about different things but coming to the same answer.
Yeah, I like that too. It's funny how Susie and Calvin can play off each other so well there, even though they're not really on the same wavelength.
Yeah. So then, kind of continuing that thread, although now Susie will lose the thread a little bit, Calvin says, "Hey, here's a joke Hobbes made up. Who do me and Hobbes look like? Give up? The Republican Party in Tammany Hall," which Susie says she doesn't get, presumably because she doesn't see Calvin as an elephant, though I have to admit, this went way over my head when I was a kid, too, even knowing that it was an elephant and a tiger. I may have known that an elephant was associated with the Republican Party, but I don't think I even knew that much. I don't know if I even know now what Tammany Hall is.
Yeah, that's kind of my reaction too. Like it's at least it's believable that a child might have somehow heard that Republicans are associated with an elephant or that's their symbol or something. But man, the Tammany Hall thing is really obscure regardless. So yeah, I kind of had to look that up myself too. I was like, Tammany Hall, and it vaguely triggered something that I think I heard about in high school. But yeah, that's a pretty deep cut.
Yeah, I guess it had something to do with like a Democratic convention was held there or something. I don't even know now. But
Yeah, there was so it again, this is not I had to look this up, but there was some kind of editorial cartoon which depicted the members of Tammany Hall, which, like you said, was like this kind of faction in, I think, New York Democratic politics, as a tiger sort of mauling the people. And so, it's portraying them as bad in this way. But um, as some of our listeners may be aware, Watterson spent some time as a political cartoonist, so that's likely where his familiarity with this came, or he certainly would have been more in tune with this with most. But yeah, that's Calvin says that, oh well, political humor is too sophisticated for girls. I don't know. I think that's pretty sophisticated for a lot of people.
yeah, it went right over my head. I know that
Yeah,
much.
that's a high level joke. That one's
Yeah. Now, Calvin's mom, like Susie, also sees him not as an elephant, but as a boy covered in mud. And so he comes in and he's tracking mud all through the house. And we get, again, though, this interchange where Calvin thinks that she's freaking out because he's an elephant, and it's not that. She flips out at him and, says, look what you've done to the house. And he says, don't worry, Mom, this isn't permanent. I'll transmogrify back to the way I used to be. And she just says, I'll see you. We'll get into the tub this instant. And I gotta think Calvin is confused here. Like, why does she? Shouldn't I change back to a kid first and then get in the tub? Okay, whatever, Mom. I'll get in the tub.
Yeah, mom has weird priorities. Like, you're now an elephant, whatever, but you're covered in mud. That's code red. So, yeah, I agree. Calvin must be confused here. And it makes me wonder, too, if his mom, I don't know, so she must mainly know what he means by transmogrify, but maybe she kind of thinks that's just sort of a word that he likes to use. Like, I know there's another strip, which I think we'll talk about in a bit, where at the end of it, she says, sometime you should try transmogrifying yourself into someone who occasionally makes an ounce of sense.
Yeah. Yeah, so she
So
clearly knows what the word means. I think part of it is that she's just so upset about the mud here that she's like, whatever, transmogrify, get in the tub.
that's true. Yeah, she almost handles it a little better than I would expect, given just the sheer volume of mud he's tracking everywhere. But yeah, that's not to
Yes,
say that she's in a good mood about it, though.
right. Interestingly, she doesn't have him clean it up, at least that we see, though I guess it was nice of her to potentially take that duty on herself,
She probably figures he'd just make even more of a mess if he tried to clean it up.
which is probably a safe assumption.
Yeah,
Yeah,
whether he meant to or not.
yeah. So that night, Calvin is back to himself. He's eating dinner, and he mentions to Hobbs that he'll wish he'd stayed the way he was if his mom is serving some veggie glop. But at the dinner table, his dad asks him to share some of his vocabulary words that he's supposed to have been learning. So, hey, good job, Dad, being in tune with the fact that your kid has a vocabulary test coming up. But Calvin can't remember a single word. He says, okay, one was, well, and his dad says, I think you need to spend a little more time with your book. And Calvin says, no, I'll transmogrify into an elephant again tomorrow, and then I'll remember them, and honestly. And then in the last scene, we see him sent up to his room, his dad not listening to the fact that being an elephant will solve the problem.
Which I will say, there is a psychological phenomenon that I'm not sure if this is the exact term, but it's a descriptive. It's context dependent memory, where it's easier to recall certain things, say in an environment where you had encountered it or where your mind made an association between it. So this isn't crazy that, being in the state of elephants, you'd of course be able to recall it, even though you can't while a boy. So Calvin may not be wrong here, really.
Yeah, well, we'll never know because he doesn't get the chance to prove it. But
That's
yeah,
true.
that's true. That's a real psychological thing. So yeah.
Oh,
Sorry,
as
what?
usual, though, Calvin then just ends up reading comic books while Hobbes does the homework.
Yes. And he coming back to the veggie glop, apparently he got what Calvin would at least consider veggie glop because Hobbes says these beets aren't bad and they're certainly salubrious, which is one of the words that Calvin was supposed to be learning because Hobbes is doing the homework.
Yes.
So it's a fun story. Listeners, you should read it if you haven't, or if you have. It's fun to go back and revisit. So those are the only two stories where the transmogrifier is used as the driving force. Again, it does make one more brief appearance, but we'll talk about that later in another episode.
You mean the cardboard box transmogrifier specifically,
Correct.
Right.
Yes, because there are two other stories where transmogrification happens, just not with the box. It uses a different miniaturized version of the device, the transmogrifier gun. So this has the appearance of a squirt gun, and it's unclear if to any observer you would see Calvin actually squirting water on himself or Hobbes, or if it's an empty squirt gun, but regardless, that's what he uses. Or maybe it's one of his dart guns, but it's some sort of little toy gun that for him becomes a transmogrifier.
Hobbes seems to think it's a squirt gun, so that would probably be the better bet.
Yeah, that's what it looks like to me. But in any event, you point the gun at your target and it uses telepathy to tell what you want to turn the target into. Pretty amazing technology.
Well, yeah, I was going to say, I mean, the first transmogrifier was amazing enough, but the improved version is even more mind-blowing.
Yeah. And I like Calvin's explanation for how you can use it. He says, "Don't like the color of your bedspread? Presto, it's an iguana." And Hobbes says, "One can only imagine the myriad uses for a handheld iguana maker." And then
It
Calvin says,
doesn't
"Well, it
have
doesn't
to be
have to be an
iguana.
iguana."
Yeah, I like that too. Not only Hobbes' reaction, but also just sort of it throws me a little bit because you expect Calvin to just say like it can be a different color or now it's red or whatever. But no, you don't like the color, so you just get rid of it entirely. Now it's an iguana.
Yep. I mean, when you're 6, I guess that makes sense.
Yeah,
So Calvin hands Hobbes the gun. He likes to test these inventions out on himself, as you do in sci-fi. So Hobbes immediately starts thinking of a slab of grilled tuna while the gun is pointed at Calvin, and Calvin's like, "Whoa, don't point it at someone if you don't have, like, stop pointing it at me if that's what you're thinking of."
that is basic gun safety, I will say.
Yeah, I mean, I guess Hobbes probably hasn't been to a gun safety training class, so you can
Well,
excuse
I
him a
guess
little
you should
bit.
have.
Yeah, or Calvin shouldn't have handed a gun to him knowing that he hadn't.
That's true.
But
That was very irresponsible of Calvin.
yeah, but Calvin is doing this because he wants to be a pterodactyl. And so Hobbes is like, okay. And then he's like, what's a pterodactyl? Some kind of bug? No, it's a big flying dinosaur. Don't shoot if you don't know what it is. And then, before turning Calvin into a pterodactyl, Hobbes points the gun and shoots at him, and Calvin turns into a chicken. And Calvin says, "Why did you turn me into a chicken? I wanted to be a pterodactyl." And Hobbes says, "It's almost lunchtime." And Calvin says, "Oh, I see. Well, I'm glad you weren't hungry for a hot dog."
Yeah, again, man, basic gun safety. It
Yep.
also puts me in mind of sort of like fairy tales and fables you hear as a child. Like I remember one that I guess, had read to us probably when I was young in elementary school. I want to say the main character who might have been a donkey, but I mean, naturally not from transmogrification, but it was like there was
Mm-hmm.
some kind of danger and they had some wishing stone and it's like, oh, I wish I was a rock so I could be safe. And then he turns into a big rock, but then now he's trapped as a rock. And so,
Mm.
yeah, so the whole lesson, be careful what you wish for. It's not exactly the same thing here, but it puts me in mind of that. That's something that always kind of stuck with me from my early education.
Boy, that story seems a little dark for little kids.
Yeah, well, so I can say I believe, again, my memory is a little hazy on this because it was, I won't say how many years ago, but a few. But I think at some point a friend of his comes by and like sits on the rock and they're like, oh, I really miss so and so who I haven't seen. I wish they were here. And so then that
Okay.
wish while touching him, that's right, it turns him back into whatever his natural state is. And like, yay. And so
Okay,
boy,
that's good.
yeah.
Yeah, that's good. Whew.
I know. Yeah. Sorry, I didn't, listeners, I didn't mean to worry all of you like that. This is supposed to be a more lighthearted podcast.
Yeah. Now, finally, Hobbes gets it right and turns Calvin into a pterodactyl, but he turns him into a tiny one because, as Hobbes says, big dinosaurs give me the willies. Now,
Right. And Calvin's first reaction is, say, when did you turn yourself into a 200-foot tall colossus?
yeah, I didn't. Why? Yeah. Um, as an aside here, we'll come back to this more when we get to our episode on dinosaurs because dinosaurs feature heavily in Calvin and Hobbes. But I am a dinosaur nerd. I just have to put this out there. Pterodactyls aren't dinosaurs. Yes, I am that guy.
Uh-oh.
Now,
That guy.
yeah, pterodactyls and the broader group, which is called pterosaurs, are closely related to dinosaurs, but they aren't actually dinosaurs themselves. However, relatedly, birds are dinosaurs. Yes, really, all birds are dinosaurs. If you don't believe me, you wouldn't be the first one, but they really are, and I can recommend some resources if you want to nerd out about that. But that means that when Calvin gets turned into a chicken, he actually did get turned into a dinosaur, just not a very impressive one.
Which raises an interesting point. And just thinking back, I'm trying to remember, like, was that widely known at this point or no? I mean, now, I mean, yeah, there still may be people who don't know that, but people who have read or seen Jurassic Park at least may be familiar with that idea now. Whereas at this point, I wonder if this was something that was just a crazy coincidence, or could Watterson even have been putting in a subtle joke like, well, actually, he was a dinosaur.
I know that Watterson read up a lot about dinosaurs, so I don't know if he knew that pterosaurs aren't dinosaurs, first of all, and I don't know if he knew that birds are dinosaurs because I looked this up. So it was kind of hypothesized in the 80s that birds were dinosaurs, and there was like a lot of scientists accepted that, but I don't know that the general public really had any inkling of that. And it wasn't until 1996, a year after Calvin and Hobbes ended, that someone found a non-bird dinosaur that had feathers fossilized with it, that it became crystal clear, pretty much indisputable, that feathers are a dinosaur thing, and as such, birds are dinosaurs. But
Okay.
yeah, so Watterson may or may not have known, but I still thought it was a fun tidbit to throw out there.
Yeah, that's almost a wild coincidence if he didn't know. It's like just by
Yeah.
sheer accident, Calvin does in fact keep getting turned into dinosaurs without realizing it.
Yeah, because we'll hit on that actually in a second here, because Calvin is mad that Hobbes made him so small as a pterodactyl. So he grabs the transmogrifier gun and turns Hobbes into a duck, which is what? A
A
flying
flying
dinosaur.
dinosaur.
Yep. So now we get an interesting and fairly rare case where a Sunday strip is integrated into a broader story arc. We talked about this in the episode on Sunday strips, but here I'll just say that without going into the details of why it's odd that a Sunday strip was integrated, Calvin and Hobbes have a battle where they keep grabbing the gun from each other and changing each other into different things, including my personal favorite, a sentient flower.
Which is still capable of grabbing the gun and
Yep.
shooting. I think Calvin is the one who gets turned into the flower, and then he turns
Yeah.
Hobbs into like an alligator or something. But
Yeah, that sounds right. And at the end of this Sunday strip, we're actually not given to know which one is which. There's a monster and an owl, and it turns out that Calvin is the owl, which again is what?
a flying dinosaur.
A flying dinosaur. So at the end, he got to be a flying dinosaur after all. Now, after that Sunday strip, we come back into the daily story arc, and Calvin transmogrifies Hobbes back into a tiger. So Hobbes was some sort of little monstery thing, a fictitious monster. And then Hobbes takes the gun and Calvin says, now do me. And Hobbes goes click, click, click. So Calvin is stuck as an owl. And at first he's horrified at this. And Mom is real nice to him about it. She says that he doesn't look like a very happy owl. And he says, yeah, I don't like mice, thinking he will have to eat mice. And she says, well, would you like some lunch? And he repeats, is it mice? I don't like mice. And it's soup. I hope it's not mouse soup. It's tomato. So
Yeah. And before this, when he got the idea, they were trying to think about what he would eat as an owl, and that's when I think Hobbes just was mice. But then we get this juxtaposition where Calvin is lamenting this and freaking out, all the while Hobbes is going off this completely different path about eating mice. And he finally says something like, I wonder if pet stores will sell you mice if they know you're going to eat them.
yeah, which actually I think they will, because people feed them to snakes and stuff. But
Yeah, it is. I mean, we have to feed snakes. We have them, I guess. It is a little gruesome to think about sometimes, but
yeah, I don't think I could do it. But,
I feel
snakes have a
sorry
right to live too. Now, Calvin does find, actually, first, Hobbes points out a silver lining of being an owl. And I believe you've brought this up before, Andy. Do you want to reiterate what that is?
Right. So a silver lining is that owls don't go to school.
Yeah. And when Calvin realizes that, so he says, I'm going to have to go to school tomorrow like this. And Hobbes says, since when do owls go to school? And Calvin pauses for a minute and then goes, zippity-doo-dah, zippity-yay, as he dances off. So the next morning...
In that case, he's a very happy owl.
Yes. And the next morning, his mom comes to get him for school. And he says, I'm not going to school today. I'm an owl. And she says, no, you're not. Get up. Let's move. And he looks at himself and says, oh, you're right. I'm not an owl. The transmogrification must have worn off overnight. Hooray. I can go to School. That's how
Poor
the story ends.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a trade-off. You can be a boy or be free from school, not both.
Yeah. And we'll talk more about the merits or lack thereof of going to school in another episode. Mostly we're
Whether
pro
or not
school
you're an
listeners.
whether or not you're an owl.
Yes.
Actually, on that note, there is at least one instance, not in Calvin and Hobbes, but in the land of make-believe more broadly, where I know that an owl did go to school. Do you know what that is?
No, that one's outside of my awareness.
Okay, so this is from Mr. Rogers' neighborhood in the neighborhood of make believe.
Oh, I
There's
should have gotten that when you said neighborhood of land of make believe. Yeah.
yes, that was a subtle clue, but yes, in any case, X the owl attends Owl Correspondence School.
Interesting.
Yes, there's. Do you know the song for Owl Correspondence School?
I don't. It's been a real long time since I've watched Mr. Rogers.
That's true. Which actually, I don't know if Mr. Rogers is still being broadcast in syndication for children, but
I know you
the
can get it on streaming services.
okay. And there are sort of like, for lack of a better word, spin-offs that are on now. Like
Yeah.
now it's a show called Daniel Tiger's Neighborhood, which kids can watch. But
Yeah, my daughter's watched that one a few times.
okay. But yes, so Owl Correspondence School. Listeners, let's all sing along if we know it. Here we go. Owl Correspondence School, dear OCS. We learn our lessons and we earn U or S. We hope for an S. Owl Correspondence School, dear OCS. Owl Correspondence School, we love you best. We love you best.
Wow. Yeah, that doesn't ring any bells for me. I'm going to have to go back and watch some Mr. Rogers now.
That is a bit of a deep cut, I'll admit, but what just occurred to me now. So there actually are instances, despite what Hobbes says, of owls going to school. So I think Calvin might have dodged a bullet here.
Yeah, because then he'd have had to go to school and be an owl. That wouldn't have been so great.
Yeah, and what would the other kids say?
Yeah. Now, there's one last Transmogrifier gun story, and this story doesn't start having anything to do with the Transmogrifier gun. It starts with Calvin holding a helium balloon, and suddenly the balloon lifts him away up over the town.
Which has one of my favorite lines. I mean, there are many, but he's just standing there with the balloon, just smiling, not really doing anything. And then, as you say, he's just carried away. And he says, "This probably just goes to show something, but I sure don't know what."
Yep.
Yeah, it reminded me of, I forget the exact context for this, but he does something which causes some kind of big mess or destruction, and his mom asks him about it, and he says, "These things just seem to happen."
Yeah, that's a different story. But yeah, all these things just happened to him. And
Yeah.
Also, just as another little teaser here, we're going to have an episode where we try to figure out where Calvin lives, and this story will provide us with one of the clues. So, again, astute listeners, you may know what I'm talking about, but if you don't know what I'm talking about, stay tuned for that episode. This arc also has one of my favorite scenes where Calvin ties the string of his balloon to his belt loop because his hands are getting tired, and as soon as he lets go, his center of gravity flips him upside down so that his underwear is partly exposed, and then his shirt falls down over his head, and he's just hanging there. And he says, "If an airplane comes along now, I'm gonna die." And this is one of those cases where Watterson said that sometimes if the writing was weak, he would go for broke on the illustration. And again, I don't know that I would necessarily say the writing is weak here, but it sure is a funny illustration.
It really is. And a similar thing, maybe not quite as embarrassing for Calvin, he goes through a flock of ducks. And then we get this great scene of him being like, "Look out, gangway coming through." And the ducks just like looking at him as they fly. And I don't know. For me, I love like the expressions on the duck's face and maybe thinking of what the ducks must be thinking at this point.
Yeah, and then at the end he says, "Boy, if looks could kill."
Yeah, Yeah, I can see he might have messed up their whole formation somehow, but yeah, I
Yeah.
just giggle thinking about the reactions of the ducks.
Yep. So, how does this all relate to the transmogrifier gun? Well, eventually, he gets so high that the pressure inside the balloon exceeds the pressure outside the balloon by enough that the balloon will pop. And Calvin starts falling. And at first, he reaches into his pocket to see if he has any gum that he could use to blow a bubble. But what he finds there instead is his transmogrifier gun. And his comment on that is, boy, these things come in handy all the time.
That's true.
I
Whether or
mean,
not you're making iguanas.
yes, that's one of its many uses around the home, to borrow from another invention. But as he's falling, he says, I can transmogrify and get home now. I'm safe. Zap. And he transmogrifies into a safe. Ha. Good pun there, Mr. Watterson. And then we're told that he transmogrifies into a light particle. Now, it's unclear how he manages that without hands, having previously been a safe, but somehow he does it. And then he zips home and then somehow transmogrifies back to himself just in time, or almost in time, not quite, for dinner, because he's scolded for being late. And so he explains what's happened, and then he says, though if I'd known we were having this, I wouldn't have hurried. We're not sure what this is, but whatever it was, Calvin doesn't like it.
Right. And I think this is the one that I alluded to earlier where his mother says, sometime you should try transmogrifying yourself into someone who occasionally makes an ounce of sense.
Yes, I believe that's correct. And that's the last Transmogrifier story. But as we said, there's also an honorable mention to another cardboard box invention where the box, like the Transmogrifier, is upside down. And this has, I think, possibly my favorite name for an invention, just because the other ones are kind of, I don't know if standard fare is the right word, but this one is called the Atomic Cerebral Enhancitron, which is just fantastic. I just love that name.
That is a good name. It's both very evocative, but also very descriptive of what it does.
Yeah, Atomic Cerebral Enhancitron. You know exactly what it's going to do.
Yeah.
Now, with this device, unlike the Transmogrifier, you don't get in the box at all. Instead, what do you do?
Well, for this one, you attach a positive string, a negative string, and then a grounding string to keep your ideas grounded in reality, which I just have to say is a hilarious touch, just
Yeah,
because I can't imagine anyone else, especially his parents, would consider this an instance of keeping his ideas grounded in reality. But I like that Calvin has that sort of safety feature too. It's like, well, we're going
yeah.
to enhance our cerebellum here, but we have to still be grounded in reality. So there's a grounding string. So again, another kind of pun.
And I believe Hobbes's quip there is, I think you're too late. So you don't just use those strings on their own, though. You attach those to a metal helmet like a colander, and then you
Right.
put that on your head. And you push the button, and the machine goes zap, and then your brain and your head swell, and you become incredibly smart. At this point, Calvin is able to unravel the mysteries of the universe. He says, "It's amazing. All natural laws can be reduced to one simple unifying equation." And Hobbes says, "Really? What is it?" And Calvin says, "Already my powerful brain is bored with such simple problems and is now working on why girls are so obnoxious."
Right. And I love both of those things. Just the matter of fact, really, what is it? Just hops. But then of course Calvin doesn't bother to tell him something that trivial. It's like, well, now we have to figure out a real problem, why girls are so obnoxious. And I will say to this day, I just still kind of think that to myself sometimes. It's like, well, but that's nothing. Now we need to figure out why girls are so obnoxious.
Yeah.
You can insert other adjectives besides obnoxious if you like. It still works, but it's just kind of a humorous aside, I think, to myself sometimes still, especially if I've got some really complicated thing I'm working on.
Yeah. Any women want to chime in on that?
I
Or
said
maybe
you
I'll,
could have different adjectives. It doesn't have to be obnoxious.
yeah. Why girls are so beautiful.
Yes, that, or just so amazing. Now we're going to get
Yeah.
kicked out of gross if we keep this up, so we might need to
Oh,
move
that's
on.
true.
But yeah, just
Calvin,
pointing
cover
out.
your ears. Now, this device helps Calvin come up with a topic for a paper where he's supposed to present two sides of a debate. And this brings us back to the dinosaurs. He has to defend one side, and the debate he picks is over whether tyrannosaurs whether Tyrannosaurus was a predator or a scavenger, which, by the way, is a real academic debate. I think it's pretty well settled these days, but it really was debated back and forth for a while. And we'll come back to that on our dinosaur episode too. But once he comes up with that topic, he has to eat dinner first, and so he loses that time. And finally, he comes back to his assignment and applies his powerful brain to the problem. And Hobbs says, "How's it going?" And he says, "Good. I just remembered what the assignment was." And then at the end of all that, he decides what he's going to write about. And as he's talking about how he's going to write that, his brain augmentation wears off. So he's saying, first we'll delve into anatomy and then we'll look at biomechanics. And as he's doing that, his head is starting to get smaller. And then he says, but first we need to draw some pictures of a dinosaur eating a time traveler or something like that, eating a paleontologist, something along those lines.
Yeah, I think Hobbs says, I notice your brain is getting back to normal size.
Yeah. But Calvin's not worried about it because now he just has to write everything he knows about tyrannosaurs, and this will be a snap, except he runs out of time and has to go to bed. So his report goes a little something like this. I say tyrannosaurs were fearsome predators because it would be so bogus if they just ate things that were already dead. I'm a concise writer, okay?
Which, I mean, there's something to that. Like, imagine Jurassic Park if the Tyrannosaurus didn't come out and start eating people, but just sort of waited around for someone to die on their own. Like, that would be kind of bogus, I think.
That would be a pretty boring movie. So yes, I think Calvin's got a point there.
Yes.
But he ends up getting a D- on the report. However, he talks to Miss Wormwood about it, and she agrees that he did pick a fairly difficult topic, so she kindly agrees to raise his grade to a D. And the lesson learned here, smooth talking the teacher really pays off.
Exactly. That's what we call grade grubbing.
Have you ever done that? I did it once.
Not exactly. I mean, a little bit, but not to the extent that I think the term really tends to connote. Like, I think there were probably a couple times where I might have argued that an assignment was more in depth than it had given credit for or something, but it wasn't a frequent occurrence.
Yeah, I did it one time in 8th grade. I had missed a day of school, so I, at least in my mind, didn't fully understand the assignment, and so I didn't do it right. And so when I explained that to the teacher, she raised my grade from, I don't know, some bad grade to some slightly less bad grade. So smooth talking the teacher paid off.
Yeah. That's true. Now, on this note, I mean, getting back to the comic strip, here's a question. What did you think about the way this one ended? And I know it's a very open-ended question, but there's something odd about this, I always thought.
I guess I hadn't really given it that much thought. I just always saw it as, all right, well, he did the report, he got the bad grade, as Calvin does, and now we move on to the next story. What did you notice?
So I agree that that's pretty on brand for Calvin, except this is the case where we could expect him to know what he was talking about. So he even mentions this in the strip. It's like, oh, I finally get the chance to write out something I know backwards and forwards, but I run out of time and I have to do a bad job anyway. But I always felt like, given how much he did know about dinosaurs, it would have made sense if this was something he got a good grade on, or at least had more to say than just the hilariously concise sentence that he had there. So I don't know. I'm not saying it makes me not enjoy this strip or think it's bad or something, but this one, I always felt a little puzzled at the end of this one when I read it.
Yeah, could have even been the one where it could have been connected to the Sunday strip where Miss Wormwood says, congratulations, you got an A, and then there's the big parade.
Yeah.
And then he's like, well, whoop-de-doo at the end of all that, because there wasn't actually a big parade. It was just all in his imagination. So, or, it could have been something like that.
Right. Yeah, so that's the only thing that always struck me as a bit strange about it. It's like, well, but he does really know about dinosaurs, so he should be able to say something.
Yeah, I guess maybe this is the comic strip equivalent of the rule of cool, where you have to make it funny before giving Calvin the chance to get an A.
That's true. Or maybe it's like you said, if this was a real academic debate, maybe even though he knew a whole lot about dinosaurs, he didn't really know that. And so maybe this was like a more obscure aspect where even someone who knew a lot like he did wouldn't really have an answer. Maybe that's the
Yeah.
best way to look at it.
Yeah, we'll go with that.
This is kind of like maybe when Calvin's talking about the season, and he's like, oh, well, wouldn't it be fun if it snowed in autumn or snowed in summer? Like, well, no, then it would be hard to run when you play baseball. And, oh, what if it did this? No, that wouldn't work. And finally he goes, heck, it's good just the way it is. And Hobbes says, we're glad you approve.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
think I've gone through that whole process on my own here with this strip. Like now
Yeah.
it makes
Mr.
sense.
Watterson, we approve of this comic strip, we've decided.
Yes. Yeah. I'm sure he was waiting with bated breath for that.
Right. Yeah. Whew. Sigh of relief.
All right. Yeah. Full from everybody.
Yeah. All right. So there you have the first cardboard box invention and the last cardboard box invention. Now there are others that we'll come to in other episodes, but that's the Transmogrifier for you.
But now before we wrap up, here's a question. Ryan, if you had the Transmogrifier, what would you transmogrify into?
That is a tough question. So I think it would be really cool to be a bird and fly. So, maybe I would be an eagle or something. I think I would shy away from red-tailed hawk. If there are any Animorphs fans listening, you might know why. I don't want to get trapped. But
Uh-oh.
And then outside of that, actually, I think I might be a tiger because I think tigers are pretty cool. And it would be pretty cool to experience that kind of just like raw power in an animal and grace and, just all the things that tigers are.
And quiet dignity.
Quiet dignity, yes.
Good looks and grace and quiet dignity.
Exactly. Yep. The epitome of all that.
Yeah.
But then my favorite animal is a dolphin, which would run up against the problem you mentioned earlier. I would have to transmogrify in the water, but it would be pretty cool to be a dolphin too. So there's my air, land, and sea choices, I think. I would go with those. What about you?
Nice. Okay, so yeah, I also thought of birds kind of first, partly because I really like birds in general. So, and like you said, it'd be very fun to fly. Now, if I had to pick one, obviously that could be an owl to go to owl correspondence school, but setting that aside, it'd be cool to be a hummingbird because then you could not only fly, you could hover and go backwards and upside down, and that would be pretty neat.
That would be cool.
Yeah, but I think I will also say another flying animal, a bat. And there's actually a
giant bugs, you mean?
Bats aren't bugs.
Listen, who's giving this report? You chatterheads or me?
Yes. But so a bat, there's actually a famous philosophical paper titled "What Is It Like to Be a Bat?" And it talks about the nature of consciousness and the subjective experience of what it is to be a certain thing and experience life like that. So if I were to transmogrify into a bat, then I could say, oh, well, now I know. We do know what it's like to be a bat. I was one, I can tell you. So that might be a good choice too.
Yeah, then you could break ground not only in science by transmogrifying, but also in philosophy by answering this age-old question.
Yes, and it would just be fun to be a bat too. So
yeah, that would be pretty cool. And echolocation too. That's awesome.
Exactly. Yeah, so that would be the trifecta: science, philosophy, and fun.
Yeah, there you go. Listeners, what would you transmogrify into if you had a transmogrifier? If you feel so inclined, let us know. And on that note, you can email us at magiccandh@proton.me, magiccandh@proton.me.
And again, this is a completely free podcast and a completely ad-free podcast. This is all about celebrating a property that we love and inviting others to celebrate it along with us.
Absolutely. As always, let's go exploring. You've been listening to The Magic of Calvin and Hobbes, a fan celebration. We'll be releasing 40 episodes all throughout the year, from November 18th, 2025 to November 18th, 2026, to celebrate the 40th anniversary. Our intro and outro music is Tchaikovsky's 1812 Overture, referenced in the Calvin and Hobbes strip published on October 8, 1986. This rendition was performed by the Skidmore College Orchestra and made available under a Creative Commons license on museopen.com. We hope you'll join us next episode for more fun.